Death at Rottingdean, Chapter 21. Honesty is for the most part less profitable than dishonesty. Plato, The Republic. It is an honest town. Mark Twain, the man that corrupted Hadleyburg. Deep in thought with Lawrence on the seat beside him, Charles piloted the Panhard up the cobbled high street of Rottingdean. He was oblivious to the delirious shouts of small children and the stares of head-shakings of pedestrians who had never before seen a motor car, and he was startled into a full awareness of his surroundings only by the furious shout of a man who was herding a flock of half-dozen nervous sheep across the street. He pulled on the brake and brought the motor car to a shuddering halt just in front of Seabrook House, leaving the engine idling noisily. "Ah, Lawrence," he said, pulling his goggles up. "We have arrived." "Yes, sir," Lawrence said. "Want me to put her in the carrier's house, sir?" "Yes, please do," Charles said distractedly and took off his duster. "Let her ladyship know that I have returned, but I have one or two important errands in the village." He lifted his tweed motoring cap and smoothed his wind-ruffled hair. "I shall return by tea time, I expect." "Very good, sir," Lawrence said, and slid into the driver's seat. The Panhard chugged off up on the street, and Charles turned to walk down the street toward the gap. The constable office occupied the front half of a narrow wooden building on the New Haven Road, on the back half of which was taken up by the jail. One of the cells had been occupied for the night by Rafe Hawkins, whom Constable Woodhouse had reluctantly imprisoned on a charge of wife-beating on a warrant sworn out by Rafe's angry mother-in-law. But after a night's cooling off, the young wife, babe in her arm, and both eyes purpled, had appeared to plead for a husband's release so that he could go on with his employment. The constable had willingly complied, sending Rafe off with a compassionate pat on the back. It gave Jack Woodhouse a great deal of satisfaction when the minor domestic misunderstandings that made up the large part of his work could be resolved with so little effort. Now seated comfortably in his chair, a steaming cup of tea at his elbow, and the sporting page of the weekly Brighton Herald spread out on the desk in front of him, Constable Woodhouse, Fat Jack to his friend and acquaintances, was the very image of a comfortable and contented man. Plump, rosy-cheeked, slow of movement. A lazy man, some might also add, and they would have been right. But Fat Jack Woodhouse had long ago discovered that where the business of life was concerned, idleness offered greater reward than industry, and honesty less profit than dishonesty. Watching the wall, as the old adage had it, paid off. This revelation had certainly made Fat Jack's tenure as the constable of Rottingdean much easier and much more comfortable than it might otherwise have been. As he contemplated his declining decades, he had little to complain about or worry. But anyone who knew the constable well would see the unwonted furrows between the eyes, notice the nervous chewing of the black moustache, and observe that despite the favourable conclusion of this morning's domestic drama and the larger satisfactions of his life in general, Fat Jack Woodhouse was deeply worried. Even as he digested the fine steak and kidney pie that had been his luncheon, the constable was already feeling the first twinges of a nervous stomach, brought on by the workings of an unquiet mind. A shadow darkened the open doorway, and the constable looked up from the cricket results. The gentleman standing easily before him had a neat brown beard and was dressed in a brown tweed walking suit, brown boots, and tweed cap. He inclined his head and spoke in a deep, cultured voice. "Good afternoon, Constable Woodhouse." With a sharp misgiving, the constable recognized Lord Sheridan. He had appeared with that meddling Kipling fellow on the beach when the constable was trying to handle the business of the body and offered to take photographs of the whole sordid mess. A bother as far as Fat Jack was concerned. Anyway, it wasn't a good idea to have pictures. Sometimes they showed more than you'd like, and they got handed around for others to look at. "My lord," he growled, folding the newspaper and pulling out a sheaf of papers, making it as plain as he could that he was occupied with official business and that his lordship was intruding upon his valuable time. The visitor stepped into the room and stood in front of the desk, ignoring the chair meant for visitors. He brought the conversation directly to the point. "I am here at the request of the Crown to ask you a few questions concerning the death of George Radford and Captain Smith." Fat Jack felt his mouth fall open and he shuddered with an audible click. His stomach lurched. "The Crown. The dead men were Her Majesty's Coast Guards," Lord Sheridan replied. "If you feel it necessary to verify my authority for this inquiry, you may telegraph the Chief Constable at Brighton." His expression was bland, but his eyes were hard and challenging. "I shall be very happy to accompany you to the post office and wait with you until you receive Sir Robert's reply." Fat Jack swiftly weighed the likelihood that the gentleman was lying against the effort required to walk to the post office and send a telegram, and decided to take his lordship at his word. He sighed. "That won't be necessary," he said. "Sit down, sir." But Lord Sheridan preferred to stand. Fat Jack, feeling that to look up at his questionnaire would put him at a schoolboy's disadvantage, reluctantly stood as well, hitching up his sagging trousers. "Well then," he said loudly, trying to sound like a man with no troubles at the back of his mind, "what questions was your lordship wanting to ask?" Lord Sheridan met his eyes. "I understand that you examined George Radford's body. What did you determine to be the cause of his death?" Fat Jack hastily reached back in his mind to his conversation with Harry Totwell and the explanation they had concocted. At the time, Harry had persuaded him that it was the best course of action, indeed their only course of action. Now he wondered why they had ever thought such a bizarre story would ever satisfy anyone who seriously inquired. But now it was too late. He had nothing better to offer. He swallowed. "A young chap killed himself," he said lamely. "And how did you come to that conclusion, Constable Woodhouse?" Lord Sheridan asked in a conversational tone. Fat Jack chewed on his moustache, trying to ignore the sharp teeth gnawing at his innards. "Well, my lord," he said reluctantly, "there was a bloodstain in front of him, and he was drowned. It seemed to me that he flung himself off the cliff and happened to fall on his knife on the way down. Anybody tell you that the boy suffered black moods and was given to drink? A despairing sort he were, my lord." Lord Sheridan gave him a thoughtful look. "I just came from the performance of George Radford's autopsy, Constable Woodhouse. I must inform you that the young man neither fell on his sword nor did he drown." Fat Jack's stomach cramped. "Me lord." "The surgeon found a nick on the dorsal surface of the fourth rib." Fat Jack stared blankly. "Me lord." Lord Sheridan spoke in a crisp, factual tone. "The victim could have received such an injury only if the blade that killed him was thrust in from the rear. What is more, the aberrations on his wrists and ankles, which you might have seen, Constable, had you looked closely, suggest that the body was bound to a heavy weight, and further, a man was observed putting the body into a skiff and rowing it out to sea." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Mr. Radford was murdered." A burning sensation arose in Fat Jack's gullet. He swallowed. "Well, He felt sweat bead out on his forehead, and his cheeks go pale in colour. "If you say so, my lord, I'm sure it's a surprise to me, my lord." He licked his lips and asked the dreaded question. "Who was the man with the skiff?" The witness could not see him plainly. He let out a small breath, feeling relief flood through him. He placed the fat of his hands on his desk to support himself. "And who was this witness?" "I cannot answer that. Are you quite all right, Constable?" "Just a little indigestion," Fat Jack said and burped. "Too many onions." "A witness? Who was the witness?" "Well, yes, well then. Now that you know the facts, Constable Woodhouse, and since you know the village, perhaps you can tell me who might have had a reason to kill Mr. Radford." Lord Sheridan's eyes were as hard as two brown buttons. Who might have wanted the Coast Guard dead? Fat Jack's mind, unbidden, flew back again to his conversation with Harry Totwell. Of course, any of the men in the village could have killed young Radford, and might have done so under the circumstances. But Totwell was the cleverest and most resolute of the lot, and, next to Foxy himself, had the strongest reason to resent Radford's nosing into village affairs. If you offered Harry Totwell as a suspect, would this insistent man go away? But if you offered Totwell and the killer turned out to be someone else, what would happen when word got about that he had slipped the stablemaster's name into the investigator? It was not the ethics of betrayal that troubled him. Fat Jack, like everyone else in the village, recalled with great clarity what fate had befallen the 10-shilling men. "Who wanted him dead?" The constable made his face blank and shook his head. "Sure I don't know, my lord. This is an honest and law-abiding village." Honest and law-abiding. Lord Sheridan's mouth quirked. "And yet you've just had 2 murders." Fat Jack frowned, thinking that perhaps he should have gone to the bother of sending that telegram. What if this man wasn't who he claimed to be? What if he were one of the investors making a private inquiry into the 2 deaths? He cleared his throat. "I don't know anything about the second killing," he said defensively. "By the time I heard Captain Smith was shot and went up to the windmill to have a look, the lot from Brighton was already there poking about." He frowned again, conscious that he was telling a lie. Several lies, in fact, and added in a surly tone an honest truth. "I didn't take it none too lightly that they came on my turf without doing me the courtesy of letting me know." "I'm sure you didn't," Lord Sheridan replied pleasantly. Well then, since you are aware that Captain Smith was also murdered on your turf, as you say, let us put the question another way. Who, in your opinion, might have reason to kill these two men? Fat Jack, struggling against his insubordinate stomach, tried to think of some halfway intelligent response. Well, sir, since they both was coast guards and both murdered, I'd say it was likely that one man killed both of them. Lord Sheridan shook his head, frowning. That assumption is unwarranted, Constable Woodhouse. They could have been killed by different people. Fat Jack felt himself to be at a great disadvantage. He could say hardly anything without revealing what he knew, and what little he could say made him sound like the village idiot. Well, my lord, he said finally, the Coast Guard at Black Rock was not much liked around here. It could have been done in by almost anybody. Not much liked. Why not? Because, sir, he poked about. Fat Jack wanted terribly to sit down. He didn't just stick to Coast Guarding along his section of the cliff. What sort of thing did he poke into? Lord Sheridan asked sharply. Fat Jack knew he had gone too far. He was just nosy, he said. He liked to know what was going on. Captain Smith, on the other hand, was well-liked. The constable nodded, relieved at the change of subject. He was friendly with the villagers, a congenial sort. Well, the constable said cautiously, I don't know about congenial. Most Coast Guards keep to themselves, but he got along with folks. How long had he been here? Where did he live? He came here 3 years or so ago from Dover, I heard him say. He lived in the cottage behind the old customs office in High Street. He had no wife. Did he have any enemies? Harry Totwell's name trembled on the tip of the constable's tongue and threatened to fall off of it. Fat Jack closed his mouth and shook his head. Whoever this man was, whatever his real business, it was not safe to name names. What about Mr. Thomas? The constable blinked. Trunky Thomas? Yes, he had thought about that possibility. Trunky had a skiff, several in fact. Trunky had just as much reason as anybody, maybe more, to want George Radford dead. And Trunky was keen to displace Harry Totwell. Had in fact gotten the backing of the more prominent villagers. Perhaps he had told Foxy that he was taking over as lead lander, and they had argued, and perhaps... What about Mr. Thomas, Constable? Lord Sheridan repeated, watching him narrowly. Forgive me, my lord, Fat Jack muttered, feeling pinned. He couldn't suggest Trunky as a suspect any more than he could suggest Harry, and for exactly the same reasons. Yeah, caught me off guard, my lord, and I had to think about it. He looked up, trying to meet Lord Sheridan's eyes. But I doubt Trunky's your man, sir. I don't know of a reason he'd have to kill anybody. He paused and added cautiously, Why'd you ask, sir? Lord Sheridan pulled out a gold pocket watch and consulted it. I should like to talk to Mr. Thomas before the hour grows late. Would you care to accompany me, Constable Woodhouse, or are you too... His lordship's mouth quirked again. Busy. Fat Jack sighed and cast one last longing look at his cold tea and folded newspaper. I suppose I can spare the time, he said grudgingly. Good. Lord Sheridan turned toward the door. I don't imagine it will take too long or prove too taxing.